Hi, I'm Reggie Ponder with the Kaleidoscope Group, and I am joined by Mary Hunter, Senior Vice President of Assessment and Research. And Mary, it's always great to kind of delve a little bit deeper into your area to see how it impacts diversity, equity, and inclusion. And this particular session is going to be about more than counting and talking about how culture really matters. And when people say more than counting, they might be scratching their head, but what do we mean when we say more than counting, culture matters?
Thank you, Reggie. Yes, I think it's a critical aspect of making diversity, equity, and inclusion decisions to think about diversity itself, which is the counting. It's often looked at as the primary measure, and it's what's called like kind of a ratio measure, meaning there's a zero, you can go all the way up as high as you are, you're just counting bodies, right? Important to know where we're at, but it's really critical to understand kind of the culture behind this, because what we know through experience is that the ability to attract and retain talent from many different backgrounds and perspectives really hinges upon the ability to value all of these differences and leverage them in the workplace and inclusive work environment. So culture trumps strategy and culture trumps counting also.
But counting is important, right?
It absolutely is important to understand where you're at from a representation standpoint, but it's not where it ends. Because to be able to keep all of these individuals who are, all from all these different backgrounds and perspectives that are adding value, to be able to keep them in the workplace, you need to ensure that you have the right culture in place that supports all of these different perspectives.
So how does your discipline impact actually retention and engagement and involvement? How does your area impact that?
Well, by taking a look at workplace culture, which we can do in various ways, one of the primary ones is through a survey around diversity, equity, and inclusion in the workplace, then we're able to kind of point to these different levers that organizations can use to either kind of support or prohibit inclusion in the workplace, which directly links to retention of diverse employees.
One of the biggest issues is you get the employees in, and then you end up seeing fall off or people leaving for various reasons. And when we're assessing companies, it seems like it is very, very important to trying to keep employees there to understand what's driving them to leave. Does that impact, is it driven by culture, or is what you're saying?
It is to a certain degree. There are other factors too. We also take a look at HR practices and the policies that are in place too, because sometimes people are leaving because they're unable to get promoted, compensation. There's lots of reasons, but culture, as we know, is definitely a key driver of employee retention across the board. And we also know that inclusion is a critical component to every organization's culture.
How do we know, Mary, from an assessment perspective, how do we know? Because we hear people say this all the time, you didn't get promoted because you weren't the best. How do we know that it's really has something to do with diversity, equity, and inclusion when we start to look at things like promotions, upward mobility, and things of that nature?
It can be a tricky one because it's hard to look at each case on an individual basis. But in our assessments where we are covering more of the HR practices and kind of the results of how these are being executed, the critical component to an example like you gave is having objective criteria for promotion so that an organization is able to demonstrate quantitatively, that individuals achieved all of the checkpoints for promotion or did not. So the challenge can also be sometimes when multiple individuals do and one gets chosen over another. So sometimes it can get really tricky, but one of the best ways to manage potential bias is by having these objective criteria so that they are measurable and you can demonstrate the criteria behind the decisions made.
So there was, I'm sorry, Mary.
And I just took a drink of coffee.
No, that's okay. So there were some some studies as it relates to, well, you and I haven't talked about this prior, but I'm gonna throw this out anyway. There were some studies that looked at artificial intelligence and the way in which a lot of companies are leaning to technology to help with the hiring process. But they found is that a couple of major companies actually found is that the information in still led to some biases. And so who they hired in terms of, let's say, like words that women might use versus words that men might use. And so when they were going through the resumes, it still ended up that they were hiring more men than more women. When we do assessments, my question is, how do we just count sometimes? Do we just say, okay, we have 1,000 slots managers in this company and only 2 of them are women? Does that matter, or do we move away from that as we look at assessments and research?
Yeah, I think it absolutely matters, but it's just the starting point. Because even with the example you gave, now that we know that there are 2 female managers, what does that mean? Why are there only 2? Why does that only represent like 5% of the female workforce at the company? What might be impeding, further advancement? There's so much behind the numbers, but they are definitely a great starting point.
So you really helped me here, is that this segment right here was about more than counting. So the key takeaway is what? Because I want to make sure people walk away with the key takeaway.
I think we've discussed actually a couple of takeaways here, because culture can certainly drive the numbers themselves, meaning, to attract and retain diverse talent, you definitely need to foster an inclusive work environment. But we also talked about having objective, measurable criteria in people practices too, so that you're able to kind of demonstrate the why behind certain decisions too, to help mitigate bias, which also would lead to greater retention of diverse employees.